Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin, and my name is Todd Pruitt. I am the pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I'm joined as always with my friend and host, Carl Trueman, who teaches at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. Carl, good to see you. Always good to be with you, even if it's from afar. Just to see your face makes my day.
Just to see my beautiful face, I know, Todd. I'm just a ray of sunshine. So, yep.
Carl, I was looking at it. I was looking at a picture of you and I from about 11 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was like right after I came to Virginia, and you and I had noticeably more hair. Like,
well,
I mean,
I don't have any
this,
hair at all.
Well, I knew this, obviously, because we've talked about it, but it was literally just like 2 days ago. I saw this picture of us, and I just thought, oh, the years have been so unkind to Carl. Especially
they have. My wife and I love to have students around several times a semester, and I always catch some of them looking at our wedding photograph and whispering to each other, "He had hair." So I was born like this, then I gained hair, and now I'm back to the condition in which I was born.
And the same thing is going to happen to some of you, and whether you like it or not. I just had lunch a few minutes ago with the pastors that I serve with here at Covenant, and we're sitting in a taco place eating tacos. And the owner of the restaurant walks up and he says, "Hey, I listened to your podcast." I kid you not.
What a sad, empty life he must lead.
but a taco shop owner here in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
I guess if you're a taco shop owner, maybe it's the only thing to look forward to.
I kind of liked it, and actually, I put taco shop owner right up there with some of the, kind of the upper echelon. I mean, if you make a good taco, you're up there.
That's true. That's true.
There are lots and lots of things that I'd rather somebody not do than learn how to make a good taco and serve it up well. Which leads
That's a good segue, because he has the vocation
it's
of
a great segue.
Taco maker.
Absolutely. We're here
segue.
talking. Yeah, we're talking about vocation today and the goodness of work, and sometimes the challenging aspects of finding out what our calling in life is, what that even means. What does our work mean? And our guest today is William Boekestein. He is the author of a new book called Finding My Vocation, a guide for young people seeking a calling. And I've been reading the book, and it's been really helpful. It's already something I want to get in the hands of parents and older high school students, and now more and more like current college students who still have no idea what they're supposed to do with their life. But Pastor Boekestein is pastor of Emmanuel Fellowship in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It is a church in the URC denomination. William, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you both. I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah. Now, one of the questions we always ask, because typically it's a good question. I mean, if you're going to sit down and write a book, you've got to be fairly motivated to do that, because it takes time to write a book. It takes time to write a good sentence, much less a book that's worth reading. So clearly, the idea of vocation is something that was heavy on your heart. You want to help people in this. Where did that come from? Why take the time necessary to research and write a book on this subject? What was going on? What burdened you for this?
Yeah, well, Todd, when I was invited to write the book, I instantly thought about my own family situation. I've got a sophomore in college, a senior in high school, sophomore in high school, and a 10-year-old. And so we're certainly as a family thinking about what should we do with our lives. And so not only my own kids, but kids in the congregation wondering what to do. And then I thought about my own life growing up, having truly no aspirations, no sense of what my life could mean. I didn't have, any idea, no dreams, and no guide. At least I wasn't listening to the guides that were in my life. And so I thought, if people who are either in that situation, not having a sense of what they ought to do with their life, or people who are highly motivated, but maybe are motivated for the wrong reasons, if they could get a glimpse of what God says to us in his word about how to work for him and with him in a meaningful calling that serves the Lord and blesses our neighbors, that's a project well worth spending some time on.
Yeah. And we were chatting just a little while ago. I've not seen a time in my life in ministry so far, which goes back to when I was 19, where I talk more routinely to young people and to current college students, and especially to boys and young men, um, who feel more adrift than they do now,
Yeah.
not really
Yeah.
understanding what they should do or what they even want to do. Is that what is that true to your own experience?
It is. And I was just reading in another recent book on this topic that something like 40% of men in their prime working years who are not working have a college degree.
Wow.
And so that's a great discouragement. So they're not
Mhm.
working, they don't have a sense of what they ought to do with their life, and they now have a college degree and probably
Yeah.
debt to go with that, and probably disappointment and discouragement, disillusionment. And the Lord doesn't want that for his people. He has called us to be productive, to be faithful with our gifts and our talents, and also to bear fruit for him. And so
Yeah.
that I find that super inspiring, that we're not just talking about how to get a job,
Mhm.
but truly how to have not only a sense of a calling, but to truly be called by God to do something meaningful in his world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, Bill, that's interesting sort of historically, and maybe some of our listeners perhaps who've come to evangelicalism or Protestantism from Catholic backgrounds, they'll be familiar with the language of vocation. And for them, it will probably carry very religious connotations. Vocation is becoming a priest or joining a religious order. Uh, the Reformation scrambles that.
Right.
What do you think is the sort of to sort of guide some of our listeners who may not be familiar with the language of vocation in a religious context? What would you say is a distinctively Protestant understanding of vocation? What do we mean when we actually talk about a vocation? Or as you point out in one of your chapters, our vocations. We
Mhm.
shouldn't reduce things to each person has one calling.
That's right. Yeah. So Carl, as you know, the Catholic tradition in the Middle Ages, especially, divided very rigidly between what was deemed sacred in life, particularly worship, and those who were associated with leading worship and facilitating worship, and the secular, the mundane, and the common. And that meant that the average worker, which numerically far outweighed the religious workers, didn't really have a calling, didn't really have a special place in God's world where they were working for him. They were just doing their job, sort of cogs in the machine. The Reformation sort of blew that apart, as you said, by especially Martin Luther's understanding of the calling of believers to an office, to a special place in God's economy to live for him. And the reformers after Luther followed after. Calvin says, as he looks at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that it doesn't matter what you are doing in life. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, you could be a slave and still have a calling. You don't have to try to find a different position, with some exceptions, of course, once you become a Christian, and in order to continue working for the Lord. You've got now a new master, new motives, new opportunities. And that must have been, I can imagine that must have been so encouraging for people in the Reformation days. And then the Puritans developed that further, and I surely paved the way for the American experience, in which we now speak of a Protestant work ethic, and all of the industries, and the public service that has been done out of the works of Christians, believing truly that they're working for God, and doing so joyfully, and with all their heart. So it's a really I think one writer said that the Reformation released the doctrine of vocation from the church into the workplace, and really initiated a revolution of work.
One of the things I've told my sons before is, look, I know you want to find a career, a vocation that is also something that thrills you, and that's great. If you're able to find that, fantastic. Thank the Lord for that. But if you have a job that enables you to pay the bills, that enables you to provide for a family, that just right there is actually a really good thing that can be
That's
done
right.
for the glory of God. Yeah, it's great if you can find that thing that thrills you, but that doesn't always happen. And that's where we have to realize that work in and of itself, so long as it's not something that's disgraceful, work in and of itself is a good thing. It's a God glorifying thing, and can, if we allow it, provide a sense of satisfaction, so
Yeah,
long as we're focused on the right things. I was talking to a guy in my church. It's a really wonderful young man, and this was when he was still getting his bachelor's degree, and he was just getting ready to get married. This is just a few years ago, and he had some of his friends that he'd come up in high school with. They were all active in a parachurch ministry during that time, and they were in this kind of radical mode, and you're not really serving the Lord well unless you're overseas, in some really dangerous spot. And he wanted to have coffee just to pick my brain because he was going to go to physician's assistant school, and they were putting a lot. He just wanted to say, can I honor God by doing that? And I said, let me tell you something. Your quote unquote radical friends, if they ever go overseas to a dangerous place, are going to need people like you to pay the bills for
right.
them. And like the church subsists, and the mission of the church financially subsists on the people who kind of uh, have entered the workforce, school teacher, machinist, physician's assistant, whatever, and serve as unto the Lord in those vocations and do so honorably.
That's
And
right.
and they're the ones who fund all of this
Yeah,
stuff.
you're exactly right, Todd. I think ministers who don't praise ordinary work and workers are sort of cutting off the limb that they're standing on.
Yeah,
I mean, but beyond that, even beyond supporting Christian causes, work itself
right,
is an ennobling thing.
right.
If you look at Scripture, really the entire book is a book of God working. Jesus says,
Hmm.
"My Father is always working, and I work." And so the model of meaningful work is actually God Himself, and He
Yeah,
creates Adam and Eve not just to hang out in paradise, but to work, to cultivate the earth, to name the animals, to sort of extend boundaries,
hmm,
and so that itself says work is very good. Yes, it's tarnished by sin. Solomon says that it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy. I mean, work is hard now, so there's no
yeah,
question about that. But yeah, the fact that you have an opportunity to provide for yourself, and ordinarily when you work well, you're going to have excess to provide for your family, for
right.
those around you. That's an unbelievable blessing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think the excess point is very important there, because I have come across, particularly in Protestant circles, I don't know whether to describe it as pragmatic or utilitarian, or what exactly it is in terms of work. But I do remember chatting once to somebody who was telling me about one of his congregants, and this guy was concerned because his wife was spending a lot of time in the garden growing flowers. And his concern was, he said, I could understand her doing this if she was going to sell them. But I can't get my head around the fact that she just wants to grow them and make the garden look beautiful.
yeah,
And I think one of the things that you touch on there, Bill, quite wonderfully, is that human vocations are not just about, you know, doing that which every other animal on the face of the
hmm,
planet does. Every other animal on the face of the planet provides for its own continuation by eating, sleeping, and reproducing. But the human vocation goes beyond that. We can make beautiful things. We have this, I think you used the language of excess there. Could you speak briefly about the idea of vocations that point us towards the excess, the beautiful excess of human
Yeah.
existence?
Yeah, Calvin, for example, when he talks about vocations, he describes some vocations which are surely not essential at all. He talks about playing music, playing a harp. Now, of course, there's a practical aspect to it. If you're going to be a harpist or some kind of musician and you're going to try to survive on that with your family, supporting your family, you have to find somebody to pay you for that. But he says in no way should we despise these vocations that are not strictly necessary, because they add to the benefit, to the beauty of our life. And surely Adam and Eve were not working to survive in the garden. They were all that they were doing in a sense was excessive in that sense. They were making life as wonderful and as beautiful as it could be. And so that's one of the keys, I think, to contentment in vocation. One of them, at least, is to recognize that what we're doing in our work, whether it's making an excellent taco, like we were talking about earlier, or whatever it is, you have the potential to increase the joy and the beauty that people experience in this world. And that's a really wonderful thing. God is, I mean, there's so much, you look out your window and there's so much of the world that from our perspective isn't strictly necessary. The colors on the birds, for example, but the Lord does that because he loves beauty, and there's a wonder to the Lord's work. And we can do the same sort of thing. So we want to get away from saying, well, my work is just what I do to survive. No, it's how I live in God's world and demonstrate that I've been made to glorify and enjoy him.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm just sitting here thinking about all the time I spend in people's homes as a pastor, and the effort that I see put in, particularly by wives and mothers, to beautify things. And some husbands are great about getting it. They love that their wife does that. Other times there are men who are so practically minded, Carl, going back to the person you mentioned, that they would, that sometimes they might even kind of criticize their wife for, and certainly we can take every good thing to an excess, but that impulse that is in people to want to, for instance, beautify their home, that's something that can be very God glorifying. I mean, one of the things it does is that when you have a guest come in, they go, "Oh, it's almost like they cared about me as their guest." There's so much God glorifying about the gratuitous things we do to make something gracious and beautiful. Those are good things, and that impulse ought to be encouraged.
And it has been a point of dispute within Protestantism since the Reformation. I remember reading Scott Manich's wonderful book on Calvin's The Genevan Company of Pastors. And I think I'm right in recalling that Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor, his wife was sort of criticized for beautifying the house, and not by Beza, but by Beza's critics within the city, that she was seen as a sort of, I think, a superficial person because she wanted the house looking nice. And I've always had something of a soft spot for the Bezos as a result of reading that story. It makes them human somehow. Those kind of stories. Think, oh yeah. To what extent, Bill, do you think the crisis of vocation, if we're going to call that young people today, is a fear of commitment?
Yeah.
I was having an interesting conversation with Rusty Reno First Things recently about tattoos of all things.
Oh.
And
Rusty, you have a lot of those?
No, Rusty doesn't have any, as far as I know. But here's we were talking about, why do young people get tattoos? And my view is, well, they're using the body as a sort of blank canvas. And he agreed with that. But then he added this extra thing to it, that he said tattoos, it's one way that young people today can do something permanent. They can find something to commit to because there's no going back.
Interesting.
And I wonder if our tattoo culture, if you like, it rests on the back of this culture where we don't give our young people, or we make them frightened of commitments. We're seeing a bit of reaction to that in the tattoo culture. But to what extent do you think the crisis of vocation, for want of a better term, is due to the fact that we have young people who just are very worried about committing?
Right. I think you're exactly right. The example is interesting, though, because a tattoo is still a very personal thing without really implications for anyone else. I can decide what kind of tattoo I want for myself permanently without tying myself to anyone else.
It's an autonomous thing.
Yeah, exactly. Very autonomous. And by contrast, if you look at a vocation like marriage, for example, which a lot of young people, statistically at least, are seeming frightened from making that commitment. You see yourself, young people say, well, I might be tied to that person for 40 or 50 years, and it might not be glorious. It might not be, I might find later on that I wish I had married someone else or whatever. And now I'm stuck in this commitment. I see my parents married for 50 years, but they don't always seem super happy. And I think something similar is the case with vocation. I see, young people can look at the older generation, sometimes people who have stayed in the same job for 40 years or so. And the euphemism is they're just chained to their work. And so um, I think there's a lot of things working against young people today. There's a fear of commitment. There is a plethora of options, and you just think about that in terms of history, where in the medieval age and afterwards, you didn't really think about your options, and that's why a lot of the older writers on vocation don't even deal with the subject of choice, because there really wasn't a choice. If your father was a bricklayer, you would probably be a bricklayer. And so now you've got all of these options. And what if I choose wrongly? Just like if I choose wrongly with a spouse, I'm now stuck with this thing. And the other thing is, I think another thing that works against young people today is what Cal Newport calls the passion hypothesis, which Todd was hinting at earlier, that we've been told today that we just need to follow our passions and our desires and our interests, and surely that will result in a rewarding career. But Newport points out a couple of problems with that thesis. One, most of us really don't know what we're passionate about at a young age, at least not in a practical vocational sense. And then the other thing is, most of the time, passion and satisfaction and contentment in our work comes through the development of expertise and accomplishments. And so what may be hard for a young person to realize at the start of their working years is it may take you some time. You may have to be in not only perhaps one job, but a series of jobs before you start to become really good at something. You know more than other people do now, and your skills increase, and you're starting to understand where your work falls in the broader connection to the world and how you're truly serving the world with what you do. And so so part of the reason for the book is to say, hey, you've got a lot of options, so you should try to know yourself, know your interests, listen to other counselors who may know you better than you, understanding that we're all very biased about what we think we're good at and what we ought to be doing. And then be patient, be absolutely diligent, work with all your heart, scripture says, but be patient for that passion to reveal itself in something that you actually become really good at through hard work. Yeah. And I think that's maybe just another thing, hard work. I don't want to sound super old, but we should not be afraid of just old fashioned perseverance and hard work. There's a good way to fall asleep at the end of the day, and that's having worked really hard. And that will actually produce satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. So one of the things I get a lot of questions about, and Carl, in your job, no doubt you have conversations like this as well. And any of us who have kids or are involved in a church and are dealing with families with kids in these situations talk a lot about this. But when it comes to decisions about college, one school of thought is, man, you go and get prepared for a particular job. Certainly there's value in that. If we're going to spend a lot of money and do that, we want to be prepared and trained and equipped to do something. And at the same time, I'm also a big believer in the value of the liberal arts. I mean, there's something really valuable about, young students learning the classics, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that's really good. But oftentimes those two things are pitted against one another. Now, what we don't want is a guy, spending 4 years in college and spending $100,000 on an art history degree and then, be unemployable. We don't want that to happen. And at the same time, we don't want to abandon the fact that we want our young people to learn about Western culture and to learn about history and to learn about those things. What I'm seeing obviously we're seeing a recession in the number of boys that are going to college. For the first time, we have more women in college than we do young men, for the first time. Same thing in postgraduate programs. Now there's, some of that has to do with the fact that we've got young men that are going, I'm just going to go to a trade school. I can make a lot of money, doing masonry or being a welder. I mean, good grief. if you're good at those things, and so all of that's great. But in both of you, in your conversations you have with students, what are you hearing, and what might be good counsel from a parent to their 18-year-old who's struggling with some of those decisions? Do I go and get a bachelor's degree? Do I go to trade school? How do I wrestle well through some of those decisions?
Yeah, this is a question I take up in one of the appendices in this book, and there's a number of questions that I think we should ask to answer the question, should I go to college? One of them is, what are your gifts?
Mhm.
I think it's just sort of assumed today that you should go to college in certain cultures and
Sure.
certain. So actually, one of the other questions is, what are the sort of cultural assumptions that are
Mhm.
driving you to answer that question? If you grew up in a blue collar family, as I did, which was wonderful, very well provided for by my father, but I never thought about college because it
Mhm.
just wasn't the culture that I grew up in. And so I think there's some cultural biases at work that we have to be aware of, and just know those things. So not everyone, but I think previous generations understood that college, liberal arts school especially, was for scholars,
Right.
and so if you are gifted in that direction, you ought to consider college. And if you're not, that's okay. And there's so many other opportunities for you. So I think, what are your gifts? What is most needed now? So as you just hinted at, Todd, there are so many opportunities today that may not require college for you. So you don't have to take those just because they're opportunities, but what is really needed? What's really important? And then I think one of the other things that you touched on as well is, what is my motivation for college? When I did finally get around to thinking about going to college after a couple of years after high school, I just went to school because that's what people my age in my sort of new social circle where I had moved, that's what they were doing. And so, yeah, that may not be the best reason to go to college,
Mhm.
or you may feel pressure from your parents or pressure from your parents not to go to college. So, and then of course, another big question is the cost. And
Right.
in a certain sense, everyone can afford college today, at least immediately,
Right.
because
Right.
you can go into school without having put any money up,
Mhm.
hardly. But that money is going to become very real in time. And so, what kind of financial plan
Mhm.
are you making in connection to college? And then another thing that I wrestle with in that appendix is the timing. For me, I could not have gone to college right from high school. I didn't want to, for one thing,
Mhm.
but it would have been a total waste. I just spiritually was not in a good place to move away from home,
Yeah.
to move away from a church. I just wasn't thinking seriously about
Mhm.
what a Christian mind is, and so it just wasn't the right timing for me. And so I'm thankful for having worked several years in construction and elsewhere. Um, Understood the value of money, because now I'm going to the business office every month to
Yeah.
write a check and it really meant something at that point. So, but I think the big thing so you just asking the question is important. Talk about it, think about it,
Mhm.
talk to advisors, people in various fields. Would this make sense for me?
Mhm.
Some aspirations require you to go to college.
Right.
And so if you have a sense of a call to the ministry, or to be a Christian school teacher, or other things like that, you need to think about
Mhm.
what that will require of you. But do ask those important questions.
Good. Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
that's great advice to close with, I think,
Mhm.
Bill. I mean, vocation is something that affects us all. Everybody has to think about it, whether you're 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old wondering what you're going to do with your life, or
Yep.
whether you're a parent or a pastor having to give advice
Yep.
to younger people struggling with this question.
Kids
So,
are anxious. Their parents are anxious for
yeah,
them over this stuff. I talk about this all the time with people.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and I mean, and if you don't want to chat to Todd about it, and you want to get some sort of sound advice, I would
Maybe.
thoroughly recommend Bill Boekestein's book, Finding My Vocation: A Guide for Young People Seeking a Calling, published by Reformed Free Publishing. If you go to our website, mortificationspin.org, as always, you can enter for a chance to win a copy. But this is a book, I would say, to get hold of, to read, and maybe buy a couple of extra copies in order to give away. Highly recommended to parents, to pastors, and to young people who are just wrestling with some of those pressing questions that come at us from a world of, the blessing of living in a world of remarkable choice is that we face questions that perhaps even our grandparents didn't face in quite as acute form. So, All that remains for me at this time is say, while you're visiting our website, if you would like to make a donation to keep the podcast on the air, please do so. And also to thank our guest, Bill Boekestein, for giving us his time today and for writing this book. And to thank you all for listening. And look forward to being with you next time.
You can have the fourth position on my list. Must admit your kisses would be missed. But how in the world could I exist without tacos, enchiladas, and beans?
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.